Most people have experienced at least one sleepless night. Maybe it was because of work, maybe stress. Maybe travel. Or simply a night when sleep never came. At first, staying awake feels manageable. You drink coffee, you keep moving. You tell yourself that one night without sleep is not a big problem. And in many ways, that is true. The human brain is remarkably resilient. But even after a single night without sleep, changes begin to appear. Not dramatically, not instantly, but gradually. System by system, the brain begins to operate differently. To understand what happens after 24 hours without sleep, we first need to understand how the brain tracks time awake. The longer you remain awake, the more sleep pressure builds. This pressure is largely driven by a chemical called adenosine. Adenosine accumulates in the brain as neurons consume energy. Throughout the day, it acts like a biological signal. The higher the concentration of adenosine, the stronger the urge to sleep. Normally, sleep clears adenosine, but when sleep does not occur, the molecule continues to accumulate. By the time 24 hours have passed, adenosine levels are extremely high. The brain begins sending increasingly strong signals for rest. At this stage, the first noticeable effect is cognitive slowing. Thinking becomes slightly less efficient. You may notice small lapses in attention. Reading becomes slower. Conversations require more effort to follow. This happens because the prefrontal cortex is highly sensitive to sleep loss. The prefrontal cortex controls planning, decision-making, and complex thinking. Without sleep, its activity begins to decrease. Tasks that require concentration become harder. Another early effect is reduced attention stability. The brain struggles to maintain continuous focus. You may feel alert for several minutes, then suddenly distracted. These fluctuations are called attention lapses. They occur because sleep pressure interferes with the brain's alertness networks. As the day continues, reaction time begins to slow. In laboratory experiments, individuals who remain awake for 24 hours show measurable declines in reaction speed. Even simple tasks require more time. This is particularly dangerous in situations that require rapid responses. Driving, operating machinery, performing medical procedures. Sleep deprivation is one of the leading contributors to attention-related accidents, but the brain does not simply slow down, it also begins to compensate. Certain neural regions increase their activity in an attempt to maintain performance. Brain imaging studies show that sleep-deprived individuals often recruit additional neural networks when performing tasks. The brain is working harder to achieve the same result. This compensation can temporarily maintain performance, but it requires additional energy. Mental fatigue increases. Another change appears in emotional regulation. The amygdala becomes more reactive when sleep is lost. At the same time, the prefrontal cortex becomes less able to regulate emotional responses. This imbalance increases emotional intensity. Minor frustrations may feel more irritating. Stress feels heavier. Patience decreases. In some experiments, the amygdala becomes up to 60% more reactive to negative images after sleep deprivation. This helps explain why people often feel more emotionally sensitive after a sleepless night. Memory formation also begins to suffer. The hippocampus struggles to encode new information. Experiences from the day are not stored as efficiently. You may forget details of conversations. You may lose track of tasks. The brain can still learn, but the process becomes less reliable. Sleep deprivation also affects the body. Hormonal balance begins to shift. Cortisol, the stress hormone, may remain elevated. This increases physiological tension. Heart rate may rise slightly. The body remains closer to an alert state rather than a restorative one. Metabolism changes as well. Sleep loss increases hunger signals. Ghrelin levels rise. Leptin levels fall. The brain becomes more responsive to hickory foods. This is why sleep deprivation often leads to cravings for sugar or carbohydrates. Another effect involves the immune system. Sleep supports immune regulation. When sleep is missing, immune efficiency decreases. Inflammation begins to rise. The body becomes slightly more vulnerable to illness. One of the most unusual effects of staying awake for 24 hours is the appearance of microsleeps. Microsleeps are extremely brief episodes in which the brain partially enters sleep while the person remains awake. These episodes may last only a fraction of a second. During that moment, the brain is temporarily offline. The person may not even notice, but if it occurs while driving or performing a complex task, the consequences can be serious. Microsleeps occur because the brain is attempting to force rest. Sleep pressure has become so strong that certain neural circuits briefly shut down. Another surprising effect of sleep deprivation is reduced self-awareness. Sleep-deprived individuals often believe they are functioning normally, but objective measurements show clear declines in performance. The brain loses some of its ability to evaluate its own state. This makes sleep deprivation particularly dangerous, because the person experiencing it may not realize how impaired they have become. As the 24-hour mark approaches, fatigue becomes more noticeable. Eyes feel heavier, thinking feels slower, motivation decreases, but the brain continues to function. It adapts, it compensates, and eventually, when sleep finally occurs, something remarkable happens. The brain enters deep sleep more quickly. Slow wave activity increases. The brain prioritizes restoration. Adenosine levels begin to decrease. Neural networks rebalance. Memory consolidation resumes. Emotional circuits stabilize. The brain begins repairing the strain created by prolonged wakefulness. This recovery process highlights an important fact about sleep. Sleep is not simply a pause in activity. It is a biological necessity. Every night, the brain expects time to restore balance. When that time is missing, even for a single day, the brain begins adjusting its function, not catastrophically, but measurably. Attention weakens. Memory struggles. Emotion intensifies. Energy declines. These changes remind us that the brain was never designed for endless wakefulness. It was designed for rhythm: wake, sleep, restore, repeat. And when that rhythm is respected, the brain functions with remarkable clarity and stability. Another important change that occurs after long periods without sleep involves how the brain coordinates its internal networks. Under normal conditions, different regions of the brain communicate through highly organized patterns of electrical activity. These patterns allow attention, perception, and decision-making to function smoothly. Sleep helps stabilize these communication networks, but after 24 hours without sleep, these patterns begin to lose precision. Signals between brain regions become less synchronized. Communication slows. The brain still functions, but coordination becomes weaker. This is one reason why complex thinking becomes more difficult. Tasks that require planning, analysis, or creativity begin to feel unusually demanding. The brain is working with reduced efficiency. Another subtle effect appears in perception. Sleep deprivation can slightly alter how the brain processes sensory information. Visual contrast becomes harder to detect. Small details may be overlooked. Reaction to sudden changes in the environment becomes slower. This does not mean the senses stop working, but the brain processes information with less clarity. Sleep loss also influences motivation. The brain's reward system depends on balanced dopamine signaling. When sleep is missing, these signals become less stable. Activities that normally feel interesting may feel less engaging. At the same time, the brain may begin seeking stronger stimulation. Sugary foods, bright screens, and novelty may become more appealing. The brain is attempting to restore energy through quick rewards, but stimulation cannot replace sleep. Another interesting effect involves body temperature regulation. The circadian rhythm normally coordinates small fluctuations in body temperature throughout the day and night. Sleep deprivation interferes with this rhythm. The body may feel slightly colder or warmer than usual. Temperature regulation becomes less precise. Although these changes are subtle, they reflect a deeper disruption in the body's internal timing system over longer periods of wakefulness. These effects can become more noticeable, but even after 24 hours, the brain is already showing signs of strain. It continues to function, it continues to adapt, but the system is operating outside its natural balance. The remarkable thing about the brain is that recovery can begin quickly once sleep finally arrives. Deep sleep becomes more intense. Slow wave activity increases. The brain prioritizes repair. Neural communication stabilizes again. Energy regulation improves. Cognitive clarity slowly returns. Within 1 or 2 nights of adequate sleep, many of the short-term effects of sleep deprivation begin to fade. This resilience reminds us that the brain is designed to recover, but it also reminds us of something equally important. Sleep is not optional maintenance. It is a fundamental biological process. Every day of wakefulness creates small amounts of neural strain. Every night of sleep removes that strain. When sleep is missing, the strain accumulates. When sleep returns, balance begins to restore. And after 24 hours without sleep, the brain is already sending a clear signal. It is time to rest. Because the mind cannot remain sharp indefinitely without the restoration that sleep provides. Wakefulness and sleep were never meant to compete. They were designed to support each other, two halves of the same biological rhythm.